In this tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to make a simple drawstring bag from one piece of fabric, a string, you can use string, ribbon, whatever you want for the drawstring, and French seams. A French seam is a little bit bigger, but the raw edges of the fabric are encased in between the first seam and the second stitching. It's called a French seam because it was popularized by French tailors to really make clean and durable things. I've done another simple drawstring bag video that was 2 pieces of fabric and we used pinking shears. So you still have a little bit of raw edge, but this is going to be another really simple way to do it, but you're never going to have any kind of fraying at all because of this seam. And we're also going to do it with one piece of fabric that is going to be folded in half. So there's no seam here. We're just sewing here and here, but we'll be sewing it twice to get the French seam effect. So let's talk about size. That is the biggest question I get on the other video that I did. So when we're doing a drawstring bag with a French seam, when it is folded, it is going to be 1 inch wider before you sew it and 2 inches taller than when it is finished. So this bag was made out of a piece of fabric that was 14 inches wide by 9 inches high. You're going to lose about 2 inches creating this channel for the drawstring. So with this one, I cut it 12 inches wide by 9 inches high. Let's get started. The first thing you're going to do, and this always feels counterintuitive, but this is how you start a French seam. We're going to fold this in half, wrong sides together. And then I'm going to take a pen. I'm going to make a really small mark 2 inches down from the top. So if this was directional, the top of the fabric would be here. This is non-directional, so it didn't matter which way I went. Then I like to put a pin up there just so I know like this is where we're going to start sewing. Then I'm just going to put 2 clips just to keep this lined up properly. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to sew from this line down here and across here with a 1/4 inch seam. Because I'm not starting off the end of the fabric and I want to keep this nice and neat with no knots, I'm going to pull up the bobbin thread. And we're going to start right here at this mark, a 1/4 inch in. So to do that, I'm going to hold the top thread. I'm going to put my foot down. I'm going to make sure my needle is lined up with that mark. I'm going to put the needle down and then pull it back up, still holding this thread, give a little tug, and that bobbin thread pops out. Then I always keep tweezers here to pull that bobbin thread, and then I use it to put both threads under the foot. That avoids me poking this very sharp needle into my finger. Now, holding the threads here, I'm going to do about 2 to 3 stitches forward and then back to knot the thread. So pulling up the bobbin thread and holding that makes it so that your machine isn't going to mistakenly suck any of that thread down and make a knot. So now we're just going to do our 1/4 inch seam. Now I'm using a 1/4 inch foot and it has a little line here that lets me know when I'm a 1/4 inch from my needle. So when I get towards the end, just go slower to line up the edge of my fabric with that line. Then I'm going to lift the foot, turn, and do the other side. So we have sewn from the 2 inch mark down and across, and now we need to clip the corners. And I don't like to clip straight across. I like to do 2 cuts at an angle. It gets more of the fabric out, and so there's less that when you turn it needs to be tucked into that really tight corner. Just make sure there's a little bit of fabric beyond the point. And then I do 1 cut here on this end just to decrease the amount that needs to be there. Now we are going to turn it wrong side out because we started with the right side showing. And I'm going to grab my turning tool and I'm just going to very, very gently rub along that crease and push out that corner as best I can. Now it's important to get that as out as possible without poking through, especially when you're doing a French seam. So our next step is we're going to make sure that we push that seam out to the edge and we get it as even as possible and press, because our next step is going to be to sew that same area, but this time with a 3/8 inch seam so that the raw edges are going to be encased within this next seam. So if we don't do a good job pushing this out and getting that corner out, some of the raw edges might poke through. So I usually just kind of roll my fingers on there to get that seam out and then press. And we're going to start sewing at this same spot. So we're not sewing up here, we're starting right here where we started the last time. So I'm just going to kind of fold that down and make a little mark so I know where that is. So back to the sewing machine. Now, because most of the time I'm sewing with a 1/4 inch seam and I'm using the edge of my 1/4 inch foot as a guide, I often will use tape or something when I'm doing a different seam allowance. And this time we're doing 3/8 of an inch. Now, there are markings on my needle plate, and I could just be looking at that line. But if you're like me, you just want something a little simpler and more visual, and this is especially helpful if you are a newer sewist. So I'm using this washi tape. If you're a paper crafter or a card maker or do physical planners, you're going to know what this is. It's a very low tack, not very sticky tape. You can also use painter's tape. I just happen to have this sitting right there. So I'm just going to place this down and make sure it is lined up with that 3/8 inch. There's a mark here and a mark there, and just make sure that's straight. So you can see that's going to be a lot easier as a guide than just trying to look at these little marks on my needle plate. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to pull up that bobbin thread to start, but this time we have a bigger seam. We're going to use this as our guide. Now again, because I don't do a 3/8 inch seam very often, and my foot doesn't have a line for it, I'm just going to quickly take a ruler, put it 3/8 of an inch from the edge of this project, and just do a little mark so that I know that when my needle gets to that mark, that's when I'm going to lift the foot and pivot. And I didn't go quite far enough because you can see I'm pretty far over that piece of tape. So I'm just going to straighten it out again and take one more stitch. All right, that's lined up much better, so let's keep going. Now we have the French seam done. You do not, I repeat, do not clip corners when you're doing a French seam, because the whole point is to have all of the raw edges encapsulated, and if you cut, you're creating raw edges. That seam just stays on the inside, and you can see out here, you're not seeing any raw edges. You might have a thread or two poking out, but you're just going to pull those out. Before we turn this right side out, we have to make our channel. So the first thing we are going to do is we are going to cut this fabric right at this line to the stitch line. Do not cut the stitches. We just need to release it from being folded. So I'm just going to cut right like that. So see, it's right at that line, but I'm able to fold this back so that this fold line lines up with this, but we're not going to press that yet. So we're going to do that on both sides. And because of the first seam, it does get folded, so you kind of have to clip that and then flip it and clip the other side. Just make sure you're not re-clipping both sides. So now those are straight. Actually, I'm just going to press that so it's straight and flat for starting. Now, before we fold down the top, we need to finish these edges. These two little flaps are going to be right here where your drawstring is going to be going in and out. And so we want to make sure that it's not going to be caught and fray. So we need to get these raw edges encapsulated. So what we're going to do is I'm going to fold this back so that the fold is even with the stitch line, and I'm going to press. I'm going to use my clapper, which is an unfinished piece of hardwood. I believe it's maple. And what it does when you iron or set seams and you press, see how it's staying flat? It helps to absorb the heat and really crease that fold. Then I'm going to turn it over and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side so that both of these folds are even and both of these fabrics are folded back. Okay, see how that is? But we still have our raw edge out. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back, I'm going to push it up. I'm going to just fold with my hand so that that raw edge is right in the crease that we just made, and then fold it back and press again. I'm going to turn it to this side and do the same thing. So fold the raw edge right into that fold, fold on the fold, and press. we're going to go to the sewing machine and we are going to stitch each of these down. So we're going to sew like this, making sure we don't catch this side because they need to be done separately so that they can be the two separate sides of the drawstring channel. Because we're done with this 3/8 inch seam, I'm going to take that tape off and we're going to get ready to sew those. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to fold the back one down. I want to make sure I'm not going to catch any of that fabric when I sew along here. And because I'm starting off the edge of the fabric, I'm not going to pull my bobbin thread up. You can if you want to, but instead I'm going to use a leader fabric. It's just a little bit faster and easier. This is just a scrap piece of fabric. I'm going to start sewing on there. Then I'm going to use the side of my scissors to make sure this stays flat and goes where I want it to go, and I'm going to guide that in. Go a few stitches and then go back. Now if there's any kind of a bird's nest, you can see there was one here from another project. It's going to be on this scrap fabric and not your project. And then you just trim that off. I'm just going to turn it around and do the same thing on the other side. And because this isn't super wide, I can just have the bag to either side when sewing. But make sure you have this part folded back so I won't be sewing on that. Make sure that's nice and flat where I want it to be. Now we have the raw edges encapsulated. Now we need to make our drawstring channel. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to fold this raw edge down about 1/4 inch. If it's not exact, that's okay. You want to be as close as possible. The main thing is to make sure that both sides are evenly folded down. So when you fold it down, just go like that and make sure one isn't way lower than the other. And then press. There's a lot more fabric folded, so that always pops up a little bit more. Now we are going to fold it down again, and we are going to have this crease come just below this line, just past where this is cut. Fold it down, and again, making sure the top is even. If you want to use a ruler to make sure it's pretty even across, you can do that. Now we're going to press that. Wasn't happy with how I filmed this part the first time, so we are going to redo it. So we have this all folded down, and now you're going to turn it right side out. I usually don't do this step because a lot of times with bigger bags, a lot of you have an arm that you can take the part off and you can sew where this is going to go around the arm. But this one is pretty small, so I don't think it's going to work for all that many people. So I'm going to show you how to do it from the right side, where you're basically sewing on the inside, which is how I always do it because of the type of sewing machine I have. So I've turned this right side out, and now we have our seam, the French seam. The top of it is pretty much raw edges. So what you want to do is you want that to fold to one side or the other. It doesn't matter which side. It's usually going to just go to one side naturally, and then you're going to put this channel flap over top, and that's why we ironed it to be a little bit lower so that we can encapsulate that. And then I'm going to put a pin right there to hold that in place. Then just put a few more pins to keep everything in place for sewing. And then as you sew, you're going to be going like this, and then you're just going to have to keep just slowly moving your bag and moving the fabric. Just make sure you're keeping that flat as your presser foot is getting up to it so that it won't pucker and do weird things. So I just wanted to show this step a little more clearly. And I am going to just sew straight across that opening. Now our sewing is complete, and we just need to add the drawstring. Now I'm going to use twine again for my drawstring, You want it to be 3 times as wide plus a little bit if you measure it after the bag is sewn, or this is basically 1.5 times as wide as the fabric was. You just want a little bit more than you need to make it easy to tie in the end. So because I am using twine that the pin would pretty much come out of, I tied it in a knot, and I'm going to take a safety pin and just put it right through. Then I'm just going to push the safety pin into the channel and move it all the way around until it comes out the other side. And that threads the drawstring. Sometimes you'll have a drawstring where you pull on both sides. This one is a super simple one where you're just pulling on one side. Okay, so we have that through, and then you want to make sure this is flat. You don't want to tie your drawstring with this buckled at all. You want to make sure it's flat so that the bag will have the ability to open as wide as possible. And then I'm just going to tie a knot pretty close to the opening of the bag. So not down here, I'm just going to do it really close. Then I'm going to trim the ends. And the reason I do it so close is because when you close it, you end up with quite a bit of string. So if you had that much ahead of time, you would have so much extra string, it would be crazy. So let's move the ironing board and measure and see if we got to the measurements I told you we should be at when we started. Okay, so I said we should be 5 by 7. So it goes from 10 to 15, yep, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, great. So starting with 12 by 9, we get a 5 by 7 bag. This one started with 14 by 9, and we got 6 by 7. So they're the same height, just different widths based on how wide we made the fabric. Super simple, super, super durable because there are no raw edges to fray or do anything. It's a nice, cleanly made bag that you can use for anything. Let me know in the comments what you would be using these bags for. Would you use it for storage, as a gift bag? You can pretty much do anything, and you can make these in any size. My name is Tara Reed. I'm an artist and a fabric designer with Riley Blake Designs. I love to teach easy sewing projects, things to sew and sell, how to sew and sell, and more. So be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, and you can also check out my website at tarareed.com.